Super Tuesday. It's a hell of a day. So, what happened? I'm gonna start by a little personal side note. I had the wonderful experience of recording a lengthy video on this topic, only to notice that my microphone wasn't working. So, this is take 2, and we're gonna go through it. If I seem a little tired, it's not just because I'm frustrated about what happened. It's because I also am an idiot and I'm still learning how to do this. And I'm going to have to go ahead and do it again. So, that said, what the hell happened? Alright. Super Tuesday was predicted by most polls to be and experts, to be a big victory for the Bernie Sanders campaign. We were expecting something like 8 states to turn out in favor of him. And instead, they turned out in favor of Biden. A lot of things contributed to this and what happened. Now, in the mainstream media, you're going to see correct information, and you're going to not see omitted information that is highly relevant to the outcomes that we saw. I'm going to briefly cover what people were talking about in what actually happened, what you saw, what you know, and a little bit about what the mainstream folks are talking about. But I want to do 2 stories that I saw that really explain a very important distinction that's going to have happened that has already affected multiple key states and will continue to affect states in the future. So, if you're a person who is in the academic world, you're college educated, you're perhaps pursuing a doctorate or have a doctorate, and you know a lot of folks who do, and you don't know a lot of folks who don't, you probably were expressing shock, dismay, and confusion today. Not because of the fact that Bernie Sanders didn't win as big as you expected. Bigly, oh my God. But you were shocked by how poorly Elizabeth Warren did. Now, if you're a political junkie, if you're following all of the information that's been out there, if you've been watching the debates, you are in no way surprised that Elizabeth Warren did as poorly as she did. Because you've been paying attention to the polling. You've been paying attention to what the stories have been coming out that have discussed her constant dishonesty. You're not surprised. But if you're in that bubble, then you definitely are. And I saw a number of people today just completely blown away by how unable she was to attain a single victory. America is consisting of 350 some odd million people who are all independently within spheres of their own making and within spheres of influence that have been exerted upon them. A lot of progressives like to imagine that we exist outside of the same kind of influence that people who follow MSNBC or Fox News fall victim to. However, we can only absorb so much information at any given time, and the information we absorb informs our opinions, and though that information is not always correct. A lot of us got it wrong, just like everybody else did. Right? Why did we get it wrong? We're progressives. We listen to progressive information, just like conservatives listen to conservative news. We didn't understand just how quickly the more conservative folks could organize and, negotiate their way into voting for a candidate that ultimately was more closely aligned with their views than ours is. And if you forgot, we already saw this happen. In 2016, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders were head-to-head. Now, Hillary Clinton had enormous advantages. The ownership of the party, the name recognition advantage was enormous. But at the end of the day, people who voted for her probably still looking to vote for another conservative or moderate but conservative candidate. And a lot of the folks who are looking to vote for a more progressive candidate are still looking to do so. Except this time they have two choices. And the moderates, as of Super Tuesday, and its conclusion, don't have that many choices anymore. In 3 days, 3 moderate candidates left the race. Klobuchar left, Buttigieg left, and as of the conclusion of Super Tuesday, so did Bloomberg. So, we now have a divided vote where progressives are choosing between one of two options, which is not the thing that they had going for them last time, and the conservatives, and that's really what they are. I mean, I don't want to keep using the word moderate. It's not moderate to be opposed to real healthcare reform. It's not moderate to be in favor of foreign wars where we're not justified to be there. It's not a moderate position to take a largely conservative stance on most of the key issues that the majority of Democrats don't agree with. We saw it last night. Most people voting tended to believe that Bernie Sanders was more closely aligned with them on the issues, but they also didn't believe he was the best candidate to win. Why? Take a guess. It's the only thing you've been hearing if you turn on the TV news groups or go to most of the major papers for the last year. You can say what you want about his policies, but he can't win, da-da-da. It's the only thing you're going to see if you go into those environments. So, of course, that's what the majority of Democrats think. But let's get into these two stories. I really want to talk about the X factor, because you know what? Conservative's going to conservative and progressive's going to progressive, right? But there is an X factor at play here that's tipping the scales in favor of the establishment candidates once again, and it's getting completely ignored once again. And I feel like we're on a path to, being right there where we were in 2016 and 17, shaking our fists as they kick dust at us and move on like nothing, irregular has occurred. And that is that the Democratic Party is now fully taking advantage of the 2013 ruling that basically destroyed the Voting Rights Amendment to the Constitution. So a lot of folks are familiar with Citizens United, but they don't understand that an arguably worse, ruling occurred just a couple years after that in Shelby County v. Holder. Okay? I'm going to read you a brief little synopsis of what that is so you understand what happened and what it does, and that's going to help really clarify what the Democrats are doing despite being adamantly opposed to this ruling just a few years back. Shelby County v. Holder is a landmark United States Supreme Court case regarding the constitutionality of two provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Section 5, which requires certain states and local governments to obtain federal preclearance before implementing any changes to their voting laws or practices, and Section 4B, which contains the coverage formula that determines which jurisdictions are subjected to preclearance based on their histories of discrimination in voting. On June 25th, 2013, the court ruled by a 5-4 vote that Section 4B is unconstitutional because the coverage formula is based on data over 40 years old, making it no longer responsive to current needs and therefore an impermissible burden on the constitutional principles of federalism and equal sovereignty of the states. The court did not strike down Section 5, but without Section 4B, no jurisdiction will be subject to Section 5 preclearance unless Congress enacts a new coverage formula. So, basically, the short version of that is there was a requirement that specific states, specific counties, had to clear their decisions to make changes in voting laws based on the kinds of dirty tactics they were playing before the Civil Rights Act, before we gave people equal treatment under the law with regards to their right to the vote. This is exactly the ruling that made it possible so that people could not shuffle voting districts around, polling stations around. People couldn't make last-minute changes or unreasonable regulations to limit voter turnout in a number of ways. And this ruling threw all of that out the window. The standard by which they measured whether a state was allowed to do anything is no longer there. So even though it's technically still true that a state can't do certain things without, they only are subject to those rules if there is preclearance, and now there isn't anymore. There's no one overseeing the activity, and so there's no way to actually enforce the criminality of the things that they're doing, to punish them for doing things that are illegal. It's like saying murder is illegal, but throwing out all of the police officers. That's what it is, right? Yes, it's illegal, but we're not going to do anything to stop it because racism is no longer a thing 40 years later, right? So let me ask you a question. What do you think was a bigger infringement on the rights of the people to vote and be heard? Tom Steyer hurling $250 million into an election that got him nowhere, or hundreds and hundreds of polling stations being strategically closed in specific areas of minority and low-income populations to suppress votes for populist candidates like Bernie Sanders? Which one sounds more damaging? Forcing you to watch crappy politics commercials, or making it so that you can't vote? Shelby County v. Holder needs to be the new Citizens United. It needs to be the thing that we look at the most to change. Because you know what? Money does need to come out of politics. But I have not heard one person talk about Shelby County v. Holder since it happened. Why are we not talking about this every day? Well, for a while, it was largely thought of as a conservative tool, a weapon that conservative Republicans could use to suppress Democratic votes, and we shook our fists at them. But guess what? Conservative Democrats said, why don't we use the same tactic against our progressive wing? Suppress their vote and stay in power. And that's exactly what they did, and what they are doing, and we do have some stories that prove it. Okay? I want to go ahead and start with the first one. This is a story very lightly covered, but the American Prospect did write a story on this on the February 28th. This is prospect.org, talking about South Carolina's election. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend for a second that South Carolina was not a victory that was going to go to anyone but Joe Biden. But what we saw here is a tactic that's going to be continued to be applied, and has already been shown to be applied on Super Tuesday. And I did a previous video that essentially discussed exactly this. In South Carolina, we saw in a specific county. Let me just go ahead and read this for you real quick. The First in the South Democratic primary will not have all of its precinct voting locations open on February 29th, it says, writing on the 28th. Despite the fact that the South Carolina has an open primary and any registered voter can participate, the biggest county in the state has closed 1/3 of its polling locations. The biggest county has closed 1/3 of its locations. Consolidating polling stations is a regular occurrence in South Carolina. It goes on to say a little bit later. And Greenville has already planned, that's the county, has already planned to do it for the first 4 elections of this year. Quoting County Executive Conway Belangia, he says, we did it for the January 7th, for January 21st, we did it for tomorrow's election on the 29th, and for a sheriff's election on March 10th. All of those elections being countywide. He's referring to the fact that on each of these elections, they are closing polling stations, they are relocating. Consolidating means relocating without notice. And a little bit, another section of the article basically says they don't tell people what's been closed. They'll tell you where to go, said Brett Bursey, executive director of South Carolina Progressive Network. Regular registered voters are unlikely to go online to confirm their polling location before every election, though. Basically, you had to go on the... what is it here? It's like a South Carolina election notification board. Let me see if I can find it here. Yeah. Oh, well, I can't find it. It's in the article. You know, I'm going to skip past it. But basically, the point is, the only place that you could go to find it was an online South Carolina election notification board. Probably something that most people don't even know exists in the state, right? I mean, how many times have you been on your state's, polling election notification board in the last few years? Imagine having to find out whether there's a new location to vote for your district in every election. How many people are going to know to do that? How many people are going to know how to show up, where to show up, when to show up? How many people are going to have the time it takes to go to these stations and do their voting when you now have compressed polling stations where votes are vastly underserved to the point where you have huge lines? We saw it in this state. Hundreds and hundreds of people lined up waiting and waiting and waiting because specific areas were targeted for closures to suppress votes. We know this is something that Republican-controlled elections have already been subject to. When you see Republican governors and the people in charge of the state-level general elections doing the exact same stuff. This is now being done at the party level with Democrats. We also, saw some surprises in Super Tuesday. Super Tuesday was expected to be an 8-state win for Bernie Sanders, if not more. We expected Massachusetts to go for him. It didn't. We expected Maine to go for him. It didn't. We expected Texas to go for him, and it didn't. And that swing, among others... Oh, and even Minnesota was probably going to go to him, and it didn't. That swing can be accounted for by an enormously masterful political maneuvering by perhaps the greatest living political tactician, Barack Obama. This is a guy who went from a county organizer to a state senator, first term, to a 2-term president inside of a decade. This guy knows how to win elections. He's a master at it. And he took his dementia-laden former vice president, 3-time big-time loser of previous presidential elections, and still managed to turn him into a champion of Super Tuesday with 2 days' notice. That's who Barack Obama is, and that's who Bernie Sanders is really up against. But while he did enormously potent things that shifted a lot of moderates very quickly into a unified Biden campaign, something else was happening in the states. When you see Texas a Texas Bernie Sanders campaign lose by a few points, you think, well, maybe that was just because Biden, who had not campaigned there, who had not invested any money in any Super Tuesday state, just got an enormous boost from Beto O'Rourke, who was thrown out of the race with almost no vote, with what was it, 1% he was polling, despite tens of millions of dollars in funding. Somehow that really helped him in Texas. The handful of percentage points that were being distributed amongst Buttigieg and Klobuchar, who were in largely single-digit numbers coming up to the Super Tuesday election, somehow that's what made the difference. Maybe you could say that's how he did better. It's how he didn't get trounced. But how did he win? Texas is perhaps the worst state in the South for the exact same tactics that we saw happening in South Carolina. And the things that South Carolina were doing were nothing compared to what was happening in Texas. Let me go ahead and open this other article up here. This is New York Magazine. All right. Super Tuesday is the biggest event on the American primary election calendar. 14 states, American Samoa, and Democrats abroad will cast ballots or caucus to help determine this year's party nominee. What looked like an impending day of triumph for Bernie Sanders was blunted when Joe Biden dominated the South Carolina primary on Saturday. The win drove stunning consolidation of support behind the former vice president. 3 of the remaining candidates dropped out of the race, and 2 of them, Pete Buttigieg, Klobuchar, endorsed Biden, later to be joined by former 2020 candidate and one-time Texas Representative Beto O'Rourke. Okay. Elsewhere, the majority of voting-age Texans will likely sit out the race. Turnout in the state's last 2 elections has hovered between 52 and 46%, which is low even by American standards. A new report from The Guardian offers a compelling potential explanation, citing data from the Leadership Conference Education Fund, a civil rights group. Reporters found that 750 polling sites had been shuttered statewide since 2012. Think about the ruling is 2013. You look back 2012. Now, if you look at the polling stations that were done 2013 and up, I bet you're going to see that's an enormous upswing. I'll have to do some research, and maybe that'll be another episode. So this is the most of any southern state at 750 polling station closing. Research from the University of Houston confirmed that it has a disproportionate impact on non-white populations, which in Texas, unlike in South Carolina, overwhelmingly supported Bernie Sanders' candidacy. From The Guardian, the quote here, the analysis finds that the 50 counties that gained the most black and Latin residents between 2012, Latinx, it says, Latino residents between 2012 and 2018 closed 542 polling sites, compared to just 34 closures in the 50 counties that have gained the fewest black and Latinx residents. This is despite the fact that the population in the former group, the one that got the most people of minority coming influx, had risen by 2.5 million people, whereas the latter category, you're hearing my Jersey accent, the latter category, the total population had actually fallen by over 13,000. So in other words, the counties with the least ethnic population shift that actually lost people only closed roughly 1/20th, a little less than 1/20th of the polling stations that we saw in the areas where a lot of folks of minority backgrounds were moving in. Observers of how disputes over ballot access have played out this past decade will notice echoes of a national pattern. In 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The major accomplishment of Shelby County v. Holder was to eliminate the preclearance requirement, the legal mandate that some states and jurisdictions with histories of racist voter suppression, including Texas, must get federal approval before changing their election laws. This shift gave Republicans carte blanche to reshape the electorate to their liking, measures that disadvantaged non-white voters and, by extension, Democratic candidates became the norm. Discriminatory voter ID laws, which, for example, permit handgun licenses but not student ID holders to vote in Texas, a state where 80% of the former are white and more than half of the latter are not, supplement aggressive and possibly illegal voter roll purges. According to The Guardian, the consolidation of Texas's polling sites into so-called voting centers which in theory centralize ballot access so people can vote close to their jobs and avoid invalidating their votes by visiting the wrong location, is convenient for some and has bipartisan champions. But it also lets jurisdictions reduce the number of polling sites by half, a convenient bulwark against the state's growing non-white population. In other words, let's say you're in a minority community, you are lower income, and you don't have easy access to transportation. Maybe you're older and you don't have easy access to transportation. Maybe you're a student and you don't own a firearm, which only 3% of Americans do. Roughly. Guess what? You're out of luck, right? Your station might have closed, might have been relocated with almost no notice. It might have been consolidated to an area that's far away that you can't easily walk to or take a bus to. You're out of luck. Now, is that going to swing a state 10 or 15 points? Probably not. But could it make a 2 or 3 point difference, or even a 4 or 5 point difference? Absolutely. A 3-point swing in the state of Texas from Biden to Bernie means that Bernie wins Texas. So, can you imagine the senior population, a college population, a minority population, all simultaneously getting their votes suppressed by complicating the way in which they can vote? You think it's at least 3%? I do. I think it's at least 3% of the population is either old, a college student, doesn't own a gun, doesn't own a car, and may not be able to make the trip with jobs, with school, with all of the complications that the average American has to deal with. So this is what's happening. It happened in South Carolina. It's happened in Texas. And anywhere where the state looks like it's going to be a close call, this is what we're going to continue to see. I don't know why progressives don't talk about this the same way they talk about money in politics. I don't know why this isn't something that Bernie talks about in every election. For a guy who got arrested on behalf of the Civil Rights Amendment cause, this should be something he talks about every day. Because you know what? It's hard to understand what millions of dollars in politics does for the average person. It's really easy to understand how not being able to vote affects your ability to vote. This message needs to be something that more and more progressives talk about, because conservatives on both sides of the aisle are now using it to cling to power. This was a long episode, and I got so many more things that I want to talk about, but I want to keep it shorter than I did in the first recording with no sound. Believe it or not. So I appreciate you guys spending some time to digest this. I really hope that the handful of you that check this out maybe start to spread some awareness. Maybe you like and subscribe and share the video. Because the progressive movement, it needs to be angry at the way that the vote is being suppressed, specifically. Y'all need to get out there with some signs, go to some town meetings, spend an hour at a town meeting. Spend an hour at an election meeting in your state, in your area, and let your voice be heard. And maybe it's going to save you a 5-hour line wait in your district. Get noisy, get upset. Make sure that they understand that in your state, they're not allowed to play these kind of games. Because if they don't hear it from you, they're going to do it to you. And if you happen to be a white, gun-owning, ID-carrying, Porsche-driving person today, that does not guarantee that you won't end up in the same camp as everybody else somewhere down the road. You lose your job. You lose your income. Something bad happens in your life. You get cancer and you have to spend 6 figures to stay alive. Maybe you're not doing so great anymore, and now you're in the oppressed group. So whether you're already in that group or not, fight on behalf of it as though you are, because you never know. Get angry, get loud. It doesn't matter who you support. It doesn't matter whether it benefits you directly or not. That this is the way things are. It may not always be the case. And that's why this law needs to be restored. why 4B of Shelby v. Oh my God, I'm blanking. Why that? Why 4B of Shelby v. Holder needs to be back in place. Okay? This is the story. Because if this is not something that we get loud about, I've already warned you in 2 videos. Bernie's going to lose. That's it. Anyway, thank you. I'll see you on the other side.